Okay, well, welcome to our weekly webinar. This is Patrick Halstead at Qdabra, and today we have a very quick webinar on submitting to SQL. Obviously, we're submitting InfoPath to SQL, and I just want to do one more quick audio check. Alyssa, if you can hear me, I just want to make sure, since I am recording, that we're capturing audio.
Yep, I can hear you.
Hey, thank you. Okay, well, it's 8:05, so I'd like to get started. We have these webinars every week, and our goal is to give you some relevant topic in a very short format. Obviously, we've got demos for you. That's why you're here. And typically, it's an overview of the techniques, and we include the samples if you send us your feedback. Alyssa?
Thanks, Patrick. Hi, everyone. It's Alyssa at Qdabra. Just wanted to tell you a little bit about what makes Qdabra such a great resource for everything SharePoint, InfoPath, eForms, and more. So first of all, we have this great community, InfoPathDev.com. This is an active forum with free support, product downloads, blogs, and is a great information resource for you guys. Next, we have a more urgent support option, and this is our pay-as-you-go support packs. Simply give us a call or submit a request on our website, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. Qdabra also does consulting work for hire. If you want a Microsoft MVP's help on a project, simply contact us. We'll help you out. We also have a lot of great tools and templates available. You can take them for a test drive. We have free trials available. And remember, we also have that 30-day money-back guarantee for all of our products. We can also help you build a scalable, lasting solution with our web services. And there's a free trial for our DBXL web service. You can download it and see how it could work for your company. Lastly, we also provide assistance to those wanting a better understanding of Microsoft InfoPath and SharePoint. We provide classes both in person in the Seattle, Washington area or online, and that's in an online webinar. So our next class for online is in August. It's the second week of August, starting on the 12th, if I remember correctly, and then the next in-person class is the second week in September. So, email us at qdsales@qdabra.com to learn more, or go to our website. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, so submitting to SQL. So why do you care? Well, obviously, SharePoint lists and libraries are great for storing information, but they don't scale beyond, well, let's say 100,000 items or 50,000 items. So for a lot of purposes, a lot of business processes that you have, SharePoint lists and libraries work just fine. But for your high-end, your scale-out scenarios, you will need to think about moving the data into SQL. You may also have the data already in SQL in your database, and you may want to use the data that exists there without having to recreate the data in SharePoint. So we've got a bunch of options for you, and these are all valid options. And we're going to be showing you 4 demos today. First of all, there's the out-of-box approach, and this is basically just creating a form from your SQL database. I'll show you that next. We also we'll show you a custom code approach. Now, the custom code approach allows you to, InfoPath is this very rich Office application, so it has complete support for writing .NET code and automation. You can actually go in there as a developer, and you can add in code into your forms that connects to the database. We're going to be showing you an option using qRules, our common library, which is a slightly better approach than having to write separate code for every single template. And then we've got business connectivity services. We've got Jimmy Rich on the line, another InfoPath MVP at Qdabra. And Jimmy's going to show you how business connectivity services integrate with SQL databases and with InfoPath forms. And then we'll talk about custom web services, and we'll show you an example of a data-driven web service. So first off, though, let's look at the out-of-box main data connection. So when you create an InfoPath form in the designer, you get the option, here's 2013 if you haven't seen it, you get the option to create your form from a database. And this option is pretty easy to use. You select your database. Here I've got one that I've already stored. You can actually have multiple tables, so we can add a table to this. And I've got a database I'll show you in a minute. I've got 2 tables, and they have a parent-child relationship, so we'll add a relationship, make sure we choose the correct IDs. We'll remove the default. And now I can actually go in here and edit the SQL statement. One thing you'll notice is that there's no way for me to add a field into my stock SQL statement that InfoPath generates for me. So that's one of the limitations. You cannot parameterize the SQL statements. but that's okay. We'll just stick with the default. And then one more thing to notice is this big red box here. If you're using a browser-based form, you cannot submit to the database, and that's a huge limitation. But anyway, you can do this. You can create your form, and it gives you this standard template. And what you'll do is you'll drag the fields over onto the template, and you can use it. And I've done that already. I've got another sample here. And what I'm just going to do is preview this and show you how this works. So we preview it, and basically you can use this form to query your data. I'm in the preview mode, so I'm going to get that warning pop up. And you can see I've got data here. Now, in my database, let's just take a look at the database real quick. Record 579 is my weekly webinar demo test. You can see that over there. That's the purpose. And lo and behold, that's what's getting pulled into the form. So this is a really simple option for those of you who have InfoPath filler forms or not using a browser to connect to your databases. And there is a way to hard code the connection to map to your database if the database is on the same server. But that's not really a best practice for SharePoint forms. Okay, so back to the presentation. So that's a quick out-of-box example. You can't use it with existing forms. So you have to create the form actually from the database to begin with. And like I said, it doesn't work in a browser. You don't get all the data types. So let's go back to the form for a second here. Let me show you the designer that I can't add fields down below here. See that where it says add field on the right down load fields. It doesn't allow me to add fields. Obviously that makes sense because the form is tightly coupled with the database schema, the database table structure. But I can add fields to the main node. So I could go in here and add an image, I could add rich text, but that data is not going to get saved in the database. And so if the form gets submitted to SharePoint as well, those forms then may become invalid if the schema on the back end changes, and you might have to migrate that data, and that would require some downtime. So there's some cons here, but the main pro is it works out of the box. Now I do see some questions showing up, so anyway, if you got questions, feel free to ask them. We won't be answering them until the end, though. Okay, next up we've got the common code approach. I'm sorry, the custom code approach. Now the custom code approach obviously requires a developer. And once again, you're adding logic to your InfoPath form that will submit the form to the database. Typically, how people do this is they'll write separate logic for each InfoPath form template. So here on the right you see A, B, C, D, E. This is a sort of a graphical schematic representation of showing that the developer, being the developer, they're going to write code that's specific to Form A, Form B, Form C, and so on. So this basically results in a very tightly coupled solution, and that's not good. And so we want to obviously reduce the amount of effort and come up with one common library that you can use in your InfoPath form template to submit to SQL, and that's my next demo. The common library is better than the custom because you don't have to write as much code. It's reusable. So you get a reusable library that you can inject in your forms. And let's take a look at this. And these samples will be made available to you. The samples do come with our database specified. So they obviously won't work on your system, but you can take a look at them. And here's the designer for the expense report form. And the expense report form that I have here, I'm just going to actually show you. I'm just going to run it first and create a new expense report item. So this is going to be my trip to the Microsoft Partner Worldwide Conference. And this is in Houston this year, coming up in July. I'm sure many of you are thinking about going. And we'll just type in some information here. And the trip is, obviously we're going to fly down there from Seattle. So we have some travel expense here. let's just say $500. And for the hotel, we'll just get the red line in, and we'll say that this one is $120. One night only. Okay, whatever. So once again, this is code in the form that's running, and it's going to be submitting to that database. Now you have to be, of course, VPN in, which I am. So that I'll show you how the code works. I'll show you how the logic works in a minute, because you're not actually writing any code with the qRules solution. But let's go to the database and check it out. So here's the database I just had. You notice that I haven't refreshed it yet, so we were just on the webinar demo test. If I refresh it now, we should see that new item show up. There we go. And the other thing that we have here is we have the report items. So if I go into my child table, you'll see that those two items came in from the form. Let's see how we did it. And this is kind of a clever technique. And what we're doing here on submit, and you can see down at the bottom, is I have the submit button highlighted. I have it selected. And you can see the rules on the right here. Now, InfoPath is great because you can write logic, declarative rules, and you don't have to be a developer. So the first thing we're doing is we're making sure that we're getting the last ID in the table. So we're querying data connection here. This is our SQL data connection, and this is just out of the box. We just went in here and created a SQL data connection there to retrieve the ID of the maximum, basically the next item from the database, so that we can insert it. Now, obviously, you could make it a SQL auto increment, so you don't have to do this necessarily. But in this case, we have done that. This is just a sample, obviously, but you know, it's fine. Now, the second rule that we have is actually going to do the insertion, and to do that, we're actually using a qRules command. So we've actually written the code for you, and that command is called ExecuteSqlQuery. Now, you can see from this command that this ExecuteSqlQuery command actually takes a bunch of parameters: the data source name, the SQL, and then we have a SQL parameter, and this is the actual SQL command. So right off the bat, you can see that, wow, we're just injecting that SQL code there. We're using those values, expense code, start date, and end date, to form our T-SQL statement, the SQL statement that's going to create those rows in the database, right? And we do the same thing for the child. And this is kind of nice because it's doing an error check. So for the child, we have a kind of a cool technique here, which is in order to run the child, we just set a value, submit equals true, and then we have another rule which is running on the table. Okay, I have to apologize. InfoPath 2013, fresh as it can be, has just crashed. You know it's a live demo when that happens. And so we're going to reboot it here. Give me 1 second. And while we're doing that, okay, so close the preview. Did I lose all of it? Yes, I did. So I'm just going to reopen the form in the designer. Bear with me. Okay, so where were we? What I was showing you was that that button at the bottom actually sets this flag called submit. If you look at the rules again, it sets this flag called submit, and that flag is kind of an interesting technique, because what we're doing here is we have a submit button, which you'll see is right there, and it's going, when we set that flag to true, it's going to basically fire a rule for every single child item. And what we've done here is we're running a separate command for every single item to basically execute SQL query to insert that item into the table, into the child table. And then what we do is, if it succeeds, we have this error check. So we know if it failed or not based on the rules that run in the form. This is a very clever technique. It's setting the field's value back to false, and then what we do at the very end is we make sure, apparently, InfoPath 2013 does not like this form. Okay, well, I promise you this did not happen when assessing it. But anyway, so we can take a look at this again. We'll try it one more time here. So in the end, what we have is we have a rule that checks for success, and then it shows that dialog box. Okay, so that's the second technique. And that's called the common library. Very similar to custom code because you're using our common library, which in a sense is code. But the benefit here is that you don't have to write the code yourself, and it's reusable across all your forms. Now we do have one question from David. Thanks for asking it, David. I'm going to get to that at the end. First I want to switch to Jimmy Risch and show you business connectivity services in a second here. And he's going to give you a demonstration of how business connectivity services can be used, we call it BCS, to connect your list data to SQL and InfoPath as well. Jimmy, are you there? You might need to unmute yourself.
Yes, I am here. I don't see the show my screen option. Do I need to change presenter?
I'll do that for you.
Okay.
Okay, you're on.
Okay. So BCS is a relatively new technology that basically allows you to connect SharePoint to your database and sort of allow data to flow in between them. So there are a bunch of steps in getting it set up, but I've already gone ahead and set up a BCS connection. It involves setting up some credentials and some stuff in SharePoint Designer. And once that connection is created, what I can do with it is I can use it to create a new list. So I'll just go here, pick external list. I already have a couple created, but just so you can see this. There I've selected the content type, the BCS connection that I created ahead of time. I just click create, and now even though this is seems like a brand new list, as you can see it already has data in it, and that data is coming from the very database table that Patrick was just showing us a little while ago. Now the interesting thing about this is that you can treat it just like a regular SharePoint list in a lot of ways. So I can go here to items and click new item and just fill in some values here. And as you can see, they're not listed in any organized fashion. Basically in the same order as the as in the table, but I can fill them out and click save. And here you can see I've got this new list item here, and if I go over to the database and refresh, we can also see that it has created a new item here. I could also go in the other direction. Let's say I wanted to enter an end date here. Enter that here, SQL Management Studio. Then when I come over here and refresh the list, we can see that that data has been entered. It looks like it's doing some adjustment for the time zones, but we can see that value has been filled in. One more interesting thing this provides is that, much like an ordinary list, you can customize the form that's used for it in InfoPath. It doesn't give you the full type of customization provided by a completely fresh InfoPath form, but basically it's bound to all the columns in the list. So I can click here. I've customized this a bit to organize the fields a little better. And I could also open it up in edit mode. And as we can see here, I've also added some InfoPath logic to do the calculations on the fly, so total is calculated for me. I'll save it here. values get updated. And if I come over and look at the database table, here they are again. So that's sort of an interesting way to allow data to flow back and forth between SharePoint and InfoPath. So there are a lot of limitations you will probably run into here if you try to use it, and either I or Patrick could talk to that.
I'll show that slide again, Jim, if you make me presenter again.
Okay, sure.
I think I can make it myself, but if you want to do it, probably be good here. Okay. Okay. So once again, there are several cons. VCS came out on the scene in 2010. We were all very excited about it. We thought that this was going to be a wonderful boon, and it didn't quite deliver on the promise. So there's quite a bit of work here to set these things up. They're not very flexible when things change. So specifically, you do need to take into consideration authentication. There's some configuration there. Repeating data is not supported. You saw, Jimmy, that you have to create two lists or do two different tables. There's no kind of relationship constraints there. Certain data types, of course, aren't supported. This is kind of interesting because even though the main data connections in InfoPath will support these, VCS will not support things like big int. So if your table has them, you need to change the schema for your database table. They do require or suggest sort procedures because otherwise you can't filter the data coming back. This is something that requires coding. And then, of course, you've got this very complex XML that you're using for these CRUD operations, these create, update, and delete operations. And of course, whenever you change things, it requires quite a bit of work with the wizard to add them back, and you have to recreate the list from scratch. On the flip side, it does work with existing databases quite well, and it's a great tool for list-based editing. And I do see another question here by Brian. I'll get to that in a few minutes here. I'm almost done with the presentation. We have one more thing to talk about, and that, by the way, the presentation will have these links to the VCS stuff. There's some good, there's a nice three-part series on how to set these up that Microsoft published about 2 years ago. And that's what we used to set these up. Also, there's a nice blog here at the end from Arjan who talks about how to configure things. So the custom web service is the next approach. And once again, you've got to write code. Microsoft actually does recommend the custom web service approach for InfoPath. InfoPath is this wonderful XML tool now. And we had a question from David earlier about the difference between Access and InfoPath, and really it boils down to, do you want an object-oriented business process, and do you want a process that's going to enable you to send information to other entities in the web? In the old days, Access was great because it's just everything is standalone, and you don't need to worry about interacting with other entities in the web. It's not a service-oriented architecture. Nowadays, with these service-oriented architectures, web-based business processes, you need some client that's going to handle that, and that means XML, and InfoPath is really the premier client for handling XML today. There is no other application out there that handles XML as well as InfoPath does, and this is really, a lot of people are rumor mongering these days about the future of InfoPath because there weren't a lot of changes in this release cycle. But what people don't remember is that 2010 had a huge amount of InfoPath changes, and they basically decided to switch their resources to work on Word and Excel in 2013. But what they also don't realize is there's no migration strategy for the millions of InfoPath forms out there today. So Microsoft is definitely committed to InfoPath in the medium term, the 5 to 10 year term. Of course, technologies change all the time. 10, 11 years ago, we didn't have SharePoint. So I think that InfoPath is really very relevant today, and there's quite a few blog posts, including posts on Microsoft's site that try to help tap down this rumor mongering out there that you see. But of course, with InfoPath, you do need a web service, and so what developers tend to do is they write their own. And once again, just like we talked about with the custom code approach in the form, you end up with separate web services for every form. And that creates a lot of maintenance cost. What we recommend is to use a data-driven approach. Use one web service for all of your forms. And this, of course, reduces your costs significantly. And the way we do this is we have a web service that takes a mapping. So we actually load the mapping that tells the web service how to map that XML data on the left into your SQL server on the right. And that's the next demo and the final demo that I want to show you. So we have a form, same expense report form here, and this form it has a submit at the bottom, and the submit is using the web service. And if we look at the data connection, it's just set up to go to our web service on our training site. So the DBXL submit is a submit to the Qdabra web service on the training site, and it's very easy to set these up. You just connect it to the SOAP web service. You select the appropriate method, in this case submit document. You set up your parameters, and that's it. Now once we have this set up, we can preview the form and submit data. I'll just quickly enter some data here since we're running out of time. Zoka's coffee. I need some coffee this morning, and Seattle has some of the best coffee around. So we'll get the company to pay for it since I'm doing this webinar. Okay, so we're submitting the data to the database, and I'm going to switch back to the database now and show you that data is live in the database. Now with the web service that we offer, we also provide a bunch of other mapping tools. So it provides mapping from the XML data into the database. It also provides a mapping from the XML data to SharePoint. If I had more time, I'd go into that in more detail. But let's switch back to the presentation. Once again, the con is you've got to install the web service, obviously. You've got to configure it with your database. So there's a little bit of work there. But the benefit is that you have one web service for all your form templates. It's very inexpensive. And that's the key thing here, is it's less cost for you to maintain. So with that in mind, I quickly want to switch to questions. I know we have one open question from Brian. I'm going to answer that. If you do have questions on anything you saw today, please go ahead into GoToMeeting and GoToWebinar, and there's a place for you to ask a question. And we will be providing these samples along with the presentation as part of our webinar kit. And if you listen to the webinar this morning, it's free. All you have to do is respond to the feedback that you see at the end of the presentation, and we'll send that to you. And I'll just start answering questions. So we have one open question from Brian. Actually, we have two questions. We have a question from David to begin with. Can you call out the pros and the cons of InfoPath versus Access? I did talk a little bit about that already, and I responded to everyone. You can see my response in the question dialogue. So I'll skip that. But David, do let me know if you still have questions on that. Brian asks a question, is there still a need to set a flag of some sort to prevent collisions while trying to write to the same ID in SQL? Yeah, so definitely that's the case for the first demo I showed with the custom code, and that's why you're going to probably want to do, you're not going to want to query that document ID into the form. What you're going to want to do is just use SQL, the auto increment, for that first demo sample I showed you. In addition, whenever you're dealing with the database, there is a potential for contention, right, where you have two different people trying to write the data at the same time. So your web service needs to lock the data. It needs to provide some kind of an indication to the client, to InfoPath, that the data is locked. So other people, when they open the form, shows read only. And our web service does do that. DBXL does handle locking and contention very well. Question from M. Matthews, does your app have to reside on the SharePoint server? No, it can be installed on a separate server in your domain. It has to be in the same domain controller's domain, obviously. But you can set up in a side-by-side installation. And you don't even need to change your InfoPath form. We do have a listener that you can install on SharePoint that will automatically submit forms to the database, so you don't have to change any of your forms at all. But we usually show the demonstration with the InfoPath form change because that's more of a standard scenario. So anyway, I want to thank everyone for joining me today. If you've got any other questions, don't forget, we're just an email away, support@qdabra.com. I'm more than happy to answer questions you have to quell the rumor mongering out there. Thanks again for joining us. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate all the interest in this topic today. Have a great day.